Welcome to the Wordy Pair Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is the Wordy Pair Podcast. We are back after a slight hiatus due to throat shenanigans.
That we could, well, you could have worded that a lot better, but we'll go with it.
Sure.
Throat shenanigans. That better be the title of this one.
we can do that. So, today we're going to be talking about a book that you've read recently.
Are we? Are we going to talk about the Science of Discworld?
I mean, I thought that was the plan.
That was the plan.
I mean, we can do something else if you want. If you haven't read the book, like if you've just been lying to me this whole time about reading this book.
I've definitely read the book, but there's 5 of them, so I. Okay, hang on. Do we want to do this now, or do we want to wait until I've read all 5 of them?
I mean, I'm in favor of more episodes about Discworld rather than less.
Okay, then let's do it.
All right, let's do it.
Let's chart a course
onto the surface of Roundworld or something.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about this book before we get started.
Okay, so the Science of Discworld ran under my radar for 26 years.
Okay.
Because I finished reading just recently. For the first time, I read Raising Steam, which I did not realize had been sitting on my shelf for years unread.
Okay.
And any unread Terry Pratchett book is a travesty.
Yes, absolutely.
So I finished that book, and at the end of that book, you know, because they used to make things on paper where they would just like slam the advertisements right there at the end, so when you were done, you could be like, ooh, is there more to read? And indeed there was.
Okay.
So my initial thought was, oh, he must have written these books before he died, because I'm looking at them.
I would assume that he wrote the books before he died.
Well, like right before is my point.
Oh.
Because I'd never heard of them before. And there's 5 of them. There's 5 books called The Science of Discworld.
Okay.
And I was like, all right, I have to pick these up, which I did very shortly thereafter. Only to open them up and find out that they were written in 1998.
Wow.
Meaning that I somehow word of these books
flew
never
completely
made it to
under
me.
your radar.
Yeah.
And your Terry Pratchett radar is not, dull. It is keen.
It is a very honed set of instincts. But then again, it's not the first time it happened, so I didn't realize that he had written several books with Stephen Baxter either, who, those of you who have been around these parts before may recall Stephen Baxter wrote The Massacre of Mankind.
Yeah, that was like 2 episodes ago.
Yeah, so Stephen Baxter gets around.
Yeah.
Hopefully he doesn't have any throat issues. So,
I mean, it wouldn't matter. He's a writer.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
If he had hand issues, that might be a problem.
So Terry Pratchett wrote that doesn't make things better.
Do you think for a moment that I intended to make things better? That's not what I do here.
I believe the words you're looking for is, I'm a physicist. I'm not here to make things better.
That's exactly right.
So Terry Pratchett wrote these books called The Science of Discworld with Ian Stewart and Jack Cohen, who are scientists that I know nothing about. There's like a foreword in here that tells who they are. And let's see. Okay, so I'm looking at some of the books they wrote. Ian Stewart wrote a book called Concept of Modern Mathematics. Game, Set, and Math, The Problems of Mathematics. I'm assuming he's a mathematician.
Sounds like he's a mathematician.
Jack Cohen wrote Living Embryos, Reproduction, Parents Making Parents, Sperms, Antibodies, and Infertility, The Privileged Ape. So I guess he's a natural biologist?
Sounds like a biologist or maybe some kind of...
he's also got a book called Stop Working and Start Thinking, so he's probably also selling, I don't know, get-rich-quick schemes on the side. Who cares?
Yeah, of course.
And apparently Ian Stewart and Jack Cohen have written books before, such as The Collapse of Chaos, Figments of Reality, Wheelers, and Evolving the Alien.
It sounds like a pretty wide variety of topics for these guys.
Yeah. So they kind of they're a bit here and they're a bit there, and I feel like they did a pretty good job in this book. So let's talk about the structure maybe a bit.
Okay.
So obviously Terry Pratchett's putting together the story portion, which is how this book is put together. It's got a story and then a science portion. The Discworld wizards accidentally create what is essentially Earth, and they're viewing it from outside the universe that Earth is in, from its beginnings to...
Please tell me it takes them 7 days to make it.
That might be in there. That might have been a joke that passed by me. It's not explicitly said, but there's a lot of jokes like that in the book.
Okay.
There's this...
But you didn't notice that one.
No, I did not notice that one.
The lowest hanging fruit in a possible creation story.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
You didn't notice any jokes about lowest hanging fruit either?
There's well, they haven't gotten quite to humans in this book. I mean, they get there, but yeah, not very far.
Okay, fair enough.
They make a joke about the orangutan, the librarian, going through L space to find a book on evolution, and I think that the reference that was made there was that he walked in on Darwin writing the book.
Okay.
I don't know who. I was trying to figure out who it was that was being referenced there, and I didn't know it, and I didn't bother looking it up. So there's a joke in there somewhere about someone.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, but it... So here's something that is a bit of a personal dislike. There's like nothing I dislike about Terry Pratchett books. You pretty much have to have two other authors involved in a Terry Pratchett book for me to find any little thing I don't like. One of the things that I did not like was actually the structure.
Mm-hmm.
Because it would go story portion and then a science portion discussing what had happened in the previous chapter and, relating it to how the Earth actually became a thing and how life started on Earth, all of that fun jazz. And the science portions, while it might have been merited, were significantly longer than the story portions in most parts, and the only thing that made that not completely irksome was that they kept a touch of that Terry Pratchett humor in the way they talked about the science in the stories, or in
the fair enough,
science portions.
So they're trying to keep it lighthearted.
Yeah, but it would be 3 pages of story and then 10 to 15 pages of science, and then 5 pages of story, and then 10 more pages of science. And the science part is cool. And if it was up to me, I would probably have just said, okay, I want to read the story part and then the science part as separate books. Like the Science of Discworld as a science book in which things are related to Discworld might have been a little better, but going alternate chapters of science and then story and science and story does one of the things that I seriously dislike about storytelling, which is to interrupt the story.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And there's actually 2 stories being interrupted because they're presenting everything that's happening with the Earth in the science portions as its own story, which makes for good reading if you've ever read... there's a specific book. I'm not going to remember the title, but I've read a lot of science books where it starts at one point and it gets to the end, and it's supposed to read it kind of like it goes in a progression of events that happened so that it feels like a story, even though it's not really a story.
Okay, so it's kind of like an artificial narrative or something other than that.
Not really artificial, more like here's what happened at the beginning of things, and as we progress, this happened, and then this. It unfolds from start to finish, without really interrupting the flow of things.
Okay.
So like I want to say midwit, that's not quite the way to put it, like a light, science light, where it's like you're not getting into the nitty gritty of it, but you're getting a lot of details about what happened in a clear picture without having to, like a discussion of quantum physics.
It's science without the highly likelies.
Maybe that's not the best way to put it. More like you get a lecture on quantum physics, but you don't actually understand. You understand what was being said about quantum physics at the end of it, but you yourself have not learned how to do. Sense. Yeah, exactly. That's probably the best way to put it.
Well, I mean, maybe you misunderstood my comment, but like, generally speaking, scientific writing contains a lot of phraseology that's like, based on this data, we suspect that, we strongly suspect that such and such is the case. Whereas, if you were writing that for the purposes of a book for entertainment, you would probably get rid of all of the references to, based on this data or these data, we suspect that, you just say this is what happened.
Yeah, that pretty much nails it. Yep.
Okay.
And so, with a few qualifiers, and they paid a bit of homage to Malthus at one point, which didn't sit well with me, but it was a brief point, so I can gloss over it.
I like the phrase "with some modifiers," followed by no elaboration on what those modifiers are.
well, with the modifier that I also have a lot of complaints about them saying that Malthus was right when Malthus was clearly wrong.
Well, it depends on... Malthus said a lot of things, so...
Yeah, so... But it was specifically about food production, and it's like, no...
Yeah, he was wrong about that.
Yeah, he was way wrong about that. But I'm assuming that's not the Terry Pratchett part. I'm just going to assume that it's the scientists thinking that Malthus is worth it.
Yeah.
I'm flipping through the book here. There was another reference to... There was definitely a bit of... So... They lean one way towards climate change in like one chapter, but that's like the one thing that when they're talking about it, they go on to give examples of like, well, this can be happening too, and this can be happening too, and then they're like, they make a sort of reference about after all this scientific stuff where they themselves have made points of, people tend to think this is the case because they get told this, and we call those lies to children. But then when they make the climate change point, They kind of like do the reverse of that, and
they lie to children.
Like, yeah, they basically lie to themselves, and they're like, even though we've said these 5 things, climate change can still be a big problem. And then like 10 chapters later, they're talking about how it doesn't really matter too much because we could all be fried tomorrow by gamma ray bursts from outer space that just happen, and we don't even see them coming.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, those things usually. Those things usually radiate with some kind of diffraction over long distances in space, and so you would expect any long distance gamma ray bursts to be attenuated by a great degree over the course of however many light years they travel to get here. I mean, it's important to remember that gamma rays, despite the fact that they have very short wavelengths, are still not particles as long as they're not being interacted with anything. Like, once they start interacting with things, they do certainly start to sound or look like particles, but they do have a wave-like nature until they start to interact with things. Then the fact that they're interacting with a thing collapses their wave function in space and, forces them to proceed forward through the next chunk as if they hadn't been diffracting for a couple dozen light years.
Yeah, and it's... I guess it's somewhat important to... I mean, everything that you just said predates 1998.
Yes.
So it's important to note that...
Yeah, Schrodinger was way back there, yeah.
Yeah, that was before what they wrote, meaning that they were obviously aware of this.
They should have been.
Yeah.
I mean, I've just been... One of the things that amazes me in general is how much people think actual scientific knowledge actually propagates in society. Like, what actually propagates at a reasonable rate are tidbits. Little bits of scientific factoid that people use to quote-unquote win arguments without actual understanding or, derivation. So, like, if you talk about whether someone understood relativity in 1940, people will say, Einstein wrote his paper on special relativity in 1905, and they'll act like that's the end of the argument, because scientific knowledge doesn't require the use of experimental observation or, have multiple models that can end up with the same result. It's a very short-sighted look at what science and how the scientific method works, and it does irritate me quite a bit.
Actually, this is a good example of how this book is pretty well written in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole lies to children thing comes up again and again in the books. It's introduced as the wizard in Unseen University, Ponder Stibbins.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like an inner monologue of his where he's thinking about how he always has to tell lies to wizards. He calls them lies to wizards in capitals.
Mm-hmm.
And they're his brief explanations to get his point across without going into too much detail because he knows that he'll just confuse them.
Yeah.
And in the next chapter, when it gets to the science portion, they start referring to what Ponder Stibbins did as similar to the lies to children that we give about certain scientific aspects, so that you get started on the concept and then you can work your way from there. But that's usually a good starting point.
Yeah. The problem being that 99.95% of people never advance past that starting point.
Well, I mean, not so much a problem in that if nobody wants to advance past that, like not everyone's going to be a scientist, obviously. So the lies to children works because you can say this thing and it's something that someone has heard enough in their life that they at least understand where you are in what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Even if they can't keep up with you. The lies to children thing actually makes a good reference to the ending of the Hogfather. They bring up a lot of the Discworld stories in the science portion to give examples to people who likely have read Terry Pratchett.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They talk about Death's speech to Susan at the end of the Hogfather, where he says that humans have to believe the little lies at first so that they can accept the big lies later on. And that's kind of what they're going with here.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't sound reassuring coming from a scientist.
Well, they don't exactly mean it in the lying sense. They just mean it in the sense that, because when Death makes that speech, he's talking about how people believe in the Hogfather.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens after this instance where, they had just rescued the Hogfather. And if the Hogfather basically has to exist for the sun to rise. And so Susan says, what would have happened if we hadn't saved the Hogfather? And Death says, oh, well, a mere ball of fiery gas would have risen up over the disk and then set later in the day, or something like that. So the idea is that it's important that people believe things, even if it doesn't affect reality or something. I don't know. There's a lot you can read into what was said there, but...
Okay, fair enough.
The important thing was it's the sun. He's making the point that the idea of the believing in something is that, well, this is a sunrise, but without this thing to believe in, it's not so much a sunrise as just, this is just reality and what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bit more to it than that, because, another point of it is that Death is implying that there's much bigger lies out there in the universe that you kind of have to accept just to get through life,
I guess. I mean...
Like people just wandering around not believing in anything are kind of a mopey, hopeless bunch a lot of the time.
Well, that's true, but you can also believe in things that are true.
Yeah.
That seems like the preferable activity, but, that's just me.
It's a romanticized kind of, little speech that he gives. It's really weird coming from Death, of course, and that's what makes it funny and interesting. Like Death has actually philosophized this far about it. But getting back to the book, there's a lot that is actually more interesting in the way that the fiction side of it presents things.
Okay.
So you have, for instance, Ponder Stibbins, after the Roundworld, they're calling it, is created.
Yeah. Well, so tell us a little bit about this creation occurrence. How does this happen?
So there's a little bit of it that I wasn't quite sure on what was going on. They were definitely making a reference to some kind of they were making a reference to quantum physics in some way, but I wasn't sure where. They were talking about how there had been this sport in the courtyard of Unseen University where the walls would reflect things in certain ways. And so they ended up using it as a containment unit for this accidental universe they created.
Okay.
Where they had... What really happened is they had created an entire universe. And they had homed in on this one planet, which is ultimately Earth. And they start calling it Roundworld. And they're just observing it to see what will happen. At one point, some of the students in the book end up doing the equivalent of, like, hacking the universe and turning it into a bunch of, like, video games and things. So they're like, they've got a bunch of comets and things they're throwing around at different planets. They're just seeing what sticks.
Okay.
And the whole time, Ponder Stibbins is observing what's going on, trying to figure out how things are working, because they discover pretty early that magic can't exist in this universe. And this baffles the wizards, and so they decide to study the thing further. At one point, Ponder has been working so long and, trying to write down different rules that he's come up with, and he's just kind of going a little crazy from it. So he's got rules laying all over, he's got crumpled up papers, and there's a scene in the book that says, "The dean picked up a piece of paper from Ponder's crowded desk. On the paper was written in Ponder's very neat handwriting, the rules. Number 1, things fall apart, but centers hold. Number 2, everything moves in curves. Number 3, you get balls. 4, big balls tell space to bend. 5, there are no turtles anywhere. 6, it's so depressing." And this is the story portion. So they kind of touch a lot on, like, physics concepts without actually outright saying them. The wizards are first literally thrown a curveball when they see that everything in this universe tends to settle on a center and become a ball.
Yeah.
And all of the wizards, of course, are like, well, this can't work. I mean, how are things even staying on it? And it takes Ponder Stibbins a while to say, it seems like everything's being pulled toward the center of things. And they slowly work their way up from the concepts from there.
Okay.
Then if we jump to one of the science chapters, I can find a good reference here. I'm just going to pick a page, and we'll say right here.
And we pray it doesn't become like a Dune check.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping not, because I don't know what this paragraph is beforehand, so I'm going to just read it.
Mm-hmm.
It says, "But that's not all that a theory of the origin of the solar system has to get right. Most planets have smaller bodies in orbit around them. Our own familiar moon, Phobos and Deimos, the diminutive twin satellites of Mars, Jupiter's 16 satellites, Saturn's 17, even Pluto has a satellite called, is that Charon? Charon? Charon?
I think so.
And that's weird, too. Saturn goes one better and also has entire rings of smaller bodies surrounding it. A broad, thin band of encircling rocks that breaks up into a myriad distinct ringlets, with satellites mixed up among them as well as more conventional satellites elsewhere. Then there are the asteroids, thousands of small bodies, yada yada yada." Okay, so there's no reference to Discworld specifically in this one paragraph, but it's... You can see where, like, the science sections are discussing directly with you things in the universe and describing the more scientific approach.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just a list of things I know, but you know what I mean. Oh, yeah, actually, the page right before that says, "To the wizards of Unseen University, the heavens include 2 obviously different types of body. Stars, which are tiny pinpricks of light, and the sun, which is a hot ball not too far away, and passes over the disk during the day and under it at night.
Yeah.
It's taken humanity a while to realize that in our universe it's not like that. Our sun is a star, and like all stars, it's huge, so those tiny pinpricks must be a very long way off. Moreover, some of those pinpricks that seem to be stars aren't. They betray themselves by moving differently from the rest." So they bring up the Discworld to compare and contrast how things operate in 2 different universes. And I believe the first science chapter actually doesn't discuss science so much as it does saying that they're taking a different approach in a lot of the chapters. Instead of comparing reality to reality, they're comparing, they're looking at it from the disc side of things and saying that we're looking at things from unreality compared to reality.
Yeah.
And that kind of can help shed a light on things in another way when you try to explain things to people. So it makes the book a little interesting when they keep bringing up things that have happened in the Terry Pratchett books that most people that would pick this up have read.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So having said all that, it's actually difficult to remember very specific things that happened in the story portion, because as I was reading it, it's like you get swallowed up in the story, and then you get swallowed up in the science, and then you get swallowed up in the story again. And for once in my life, there were some very specific funny things that happened in this book. Not a single one of them is coming to mind now that I need to recall them. Because every time I try to think of what happened in the story chapters, I'm like, no, wait, that might have been the science chapter. And it's like, I know there were jokes somewhere.
Well,
yeah, like
I mean, it's one of those things
forgotten.
where if you're constantly changing your state of mind, if you're constantly going from, okay, we're talking science, okay, we're talking, funny fantasy story, okay, we're talking science, that it becomes hard to, if you're constantly switching your state of mind, you're going to find your retention is a little lower than normal, I think.
Yeah, and
also you were very sick.
Oh yeah, no, I what are we on our third week hiatus?
Well, I mean, sort of.
I think it's been 3 weeks since we recorded.
It's been 3 weeks since we recorded, yes, but we had
obviously
extra episodes lined up. So just for a callback, this is why I said the phrase "throat shenanigans" at the start of the episode, is because you were completely out of commission for 3 weeks.
Yeah, I'm still semi out of commission. I can already feel my throat hurting again just talking this much, but we made it this far. We can finish this one up, no problem. I'm staving off
3
a bit
more weeks of dearth of nothingness.
Yeah,
hopefully not.
But no, there were just several days where I absolutely could not talk for more than a couple seconds without hacking up a lung.
Yeah.
But getting those visuals aside, I do remember enough about what happened in the story to where I can point out some of the interesting things that happened on the fiction side. The science side, I would want to leave to whoever wants to pick up the book and read it, because they do a pretty nice job of presenting some concepts on that side. And there's a lot of information in there. There was reference to an experiment I wasn't aware of that someone had done. I don't remember the names, of course. I never remember the names of the people who actually do these things. Well, except for Claude Shannon. I'm never going to forget Claude Shannon after you said do not take his name in vain. No, but someone had done an experiment where they had figured that, okay, well, maybe there is some difference if we do an evolution experiment with actual electronic components as opposed to just making a computer algorithm to run as software. Yeah. And they did come to some surprising conclusions that having the actual machinery set up to find ways to evolve did create weird situations where processes that clearly did not need certain portions of the design would not work if that part of the design was taken away. And I can understand how that can happen from an engineering perspective.
Sure.
You can look on paper and be like, okay, it only really needs these components to do this. But however it was set up, still required these other pathways to activate what was happening, because it was not happening in the straightforward way that it totally could be happening with just these other components. If that makes sense to anyone listening.
Yeah, so basically information went somewhere that it didn't need to go, but it had been kind of evolutionarily inclined to go.
Yeah, because they were talking about different things that happened in evolution that may not seem like they're necessary nowadays, but probably had a historical use that just, you don't just lose it.
Yeah.
Over time genetically just because it no longer has a modern day use.
Well, I mean, the way that genetics works is that, information is encoded, but that information is encoded in a variety of places in a variety of forms, and therefore, evolution is evolution mixed with natural selection is good at improving things. I mean, good in a geological sense, right? Because it takes forever. But it's not good at getting rid of things that are no longer necessary, especially when those things... It makes them smaller, but they usually don't go away, right?
Yeah. It can whittle away at them or make them recessive.
At some point, there's no significant loss for having... the human appendix is a good example, right? Like, how much does your appendix weigh? 100 grams? What's the marginal cost in food consumption for sustaining an additional 100 grams of body mass? Not much. Therefore, there's not a whole lot of evolutionary pressure to reduce it even further.
Right. Yeah,
and as a medical thing, we've perfected the procedure of removing infected appendices before they can kill you, and so that even further reduces the amount of negative evolutionary effects that it has, right? Because people aren't dying before they have kids because their appendix burst.
Right. So now we got a bunch of people running around with bad appendices.
Well, no, we take out the bad ones. They just still have the gene to produce one.
Yeah, and there's a joke in there about appendices somewhere. I don't know. It's a writing podcast. And anyway, speaking of jokes, even though I couldn't remember very many specific ones, there was a lot that happened in the story side of Discworld that was just kind of funny on its face, because Terry Pratchett is famous for taking technological ideas and putting a Discworld spin on them.
Sure.
He did it with the computer Hex, which actually plays a pretty large role in this story. Hex, of course, being the Unseen University's wizardly supercomputer, which I believe was built by Ponder Stibbins and a few students in one of the early books.
Okay.
And it's kind of like mechanically Steam-based sort of... Maybe not Steam, because Steam is actually the concept of a book, but like, so it has an anthill, like the classic anthill computer. And one of the jokes in the old book that gets referenced in the Science of Discworld is how Hex has a sticker on the anthill that says anthill inside, which is a reference, of course, to the Intel inside sticker that they used to put on PCs back in the 90s.
Yeah.
With the Intel Pentium chips.
Right.
So Hex is working out a lot of the calculations to help the wizards determine what they can do in the Roundworld universe to make things happen. Although they're not very successful at making things happen so much. Initially, one of the wizards had stuck his hand inside the universe to see what happens, which that's essentially exactly how it went down. It's the quintessential poking something with a stick scientifically.
Yeah.
And then there were a bunch of jokes following that about how that kind of makes him the god of that universe. And so when it looked like life wasn't going to survive on Roundworld, and they were all saying, well, great. Well, now that usually what happens when the world is ending, a bunch of heroes show up. So are a bunch of heroes going to show up and start attacking the Dean or something? And a lot of the usual Terry Pratchett humor. I know you're familiar with it. Yeah. Anyone who hasn't read Pratchett, get on that. You don't understand.
Go read Pratchett.
Hit pause, go read an entire Pratchett book, come back when you're done with your homework.
Read a Pratchett book. Doesn't matter which one.
Yeah, maybe not his very first one, which for some reason I can't remember the title of.
His first Discworld book or his first book?
No. Well, it was technically a Discworld book. So the first book that he wrote was a science fiction story that took place on a Discworld, which, for some purposes we can say is the Discworld, but it was never related to the rest of Discworld. It was a story about these aliens that it was essentially a parody of Larry Niven's Ringworld.
Sure.
And a bunch of, different race of aliens came to this Discworld to try and figure out how it was working. And they went on some weird adventure that ultimately culminated with them ending up in the center of the Discworld, where some guy had a machine that was running things or something. And it was a good book.
Sure.
I'm not saying not to read that book. I'm saying that all of the Discworld books are better than that book. That was his opener, and it was a great science fiction opener. especially given that it was supposed to be parody.
Yeah.
Fantastic opener. But all of the Discworld books are more entertaining. And, that's coming from someone who enjoys sci-fi more than fantasy in most cases. Let's see. There's other things that Pratchett has done, such as he wanted to kind of make a Victorian age version of the internet, which he did in a book called Going Postal.
Yeah.
Where there was this new thing that it was called the clacks. And
yeah, I've heard of. I mean, I've read books that were written after Going Postal, so I've heard of the clacks, and there's a word for the. Anyway, yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Well, yeah, I know you are, but yeah, he invents the internet in an age where it has to be run with drawstrings and lights. So it's a bunch of people in towers that are pulling ropes and shining different lights at other towers to send messages. And Terry Pratchett, having an engineering background, he worked out in pretty good detail how this might work without actually having to sit down and like diagramming it all out to make sure it works. At least as far as I know.
Yeah.
And it makes for good storytelling, of course, because now you're in this world where people are still using horses and carts, and there's the internet. And one of the jokes in the books is that you have the patrician of a city is playing chess with someone. Well, a game called Thud that is essentially chess with someone from a far off country, and he gets angry that the towers keep going down during his game, which is why he decides to reinstate the post office, which creates a conflict between the person who runs the clacks and the person who gets put in charge of the post office. And there's your story.
Okay.
He does the same with the steam engine, except this one is a little less ludicrous because he just essentially says, yeah, we're going to put steam engines on Discworld. And insofar as I know, that was the last full Discworld book that he wrote. There might be another one. I'm pretty sure that's his last one before he died.
Fair enough.
So getting back to the Science of Discworld, he does a couple of things like this. And since, of course, the chapters are only a couple of pages apiece when it's story portion, he doesn't quite go into as much detail, but he does create a virtual reality suit for one of the wizards. And of course, it would be Rincewind. I'll get to that in a minute. He creates a virtual reality suit that uses magic to teleport the mental state of a person to the physical world of Roundworld.
Okay.
And for anyone who hasn't read, again, the Discworld books, his first ones involved a character named Rincewind, a cowardly wizard who had no ability to use magic spells because he accidentally opened a magic book that a very powerful spell jumps into his head. All the other magic is scared away by this. And so he can't use magic. He ends up having to take the Discworld's first tourist on a tour guide, a guided tour of various locations on pain of death by the patrician of Ankh-Morpork.
Yeah.
And he ends up on a lot of adventures where his cowardly traits of running away from everything become very apparent. And yet, inexplicably, this man manages to save the world in every single book that he is in. All he ever does is run away from things, and he somehow saves the world again and again. And
I mean, you and I both know that of the 36 ways to extricate yourself from a situation, running away is the best.
That is true.
And clearly, it's the best. It saves the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's case in point. It's a really great... Rincewind's a great character. I mean, there's so many things that he did. He's the most well-traveled person on the entire Discworld, for sure.
Yeah.
Just from running away from things. But in the later books, he hasn't had his own book in a very long time, and he never will now, but he has shown up as a side character in a few books.
Sure.
I think in Unseen Academicals, he was referenced once or twice. He might have had a line.
Mm-hmm.
He was referenced in Raising Steam as, he was afraid to get on the train, there was some joke in there about that.
Yeah.
And then he realized that trains can take you away from things very fast, so he considered it running away from things, so he liked trains in the end.
Okay.
And then he's kind of all over in the Science of Discworld, but not in any. There's no real like character development in this story for these characters, especially Rincewind, whose character is pretty much fully developed at this point.
Yeah.
And I think he might have been in one more book after the Science of Discworld novels, but never as a main character again.
In a minor role, yeah.
Unless, well, no, maybe The Last Hero, which was a book about Rincewind going to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
So they decide that they need someone to explore this world.
Yeah.
And of course, everyone knows that, well, Rincewind's been everywhere, so clearly he's the person for the job. And they always kind of force him into it. Like in The Last Hero, when they want him to go to the moon, they bring him into an office and they're going to take away his wizard privileges. They're essentially going to kick him out of the university, and they kind of start dropping hints like, unless, of course, you could perform some great service to the study of magic. And he kind of pipes up and says, I may have saved the world once or twice. Does that count?
Right.
And one of the wizards says, well, did anyone see you do it? And half the wizards there had seen him do it.
Right.
And so he's kind of like, all right, what do you need me to do? And that kind of happens in this book but instead of really forcing him, they kind of say, look, we'll give you a promotion and it'll come with like extra meals and you'll get laundry service. And he's like, well, I already get that. And the Arch-Chancellor of the university says, well, not from now on, you don't. And so it's like, okay, fine. They're like, it's not a big deal this time. We're going to put you in this machine. We're going to send you to another universe. And he's like, wait a minute. He's like, no, it's cool. You're not really going to be there. And they spend a good page trying to talk him into this and explain to him that nothing can really hurt him.
Yeah.
They make a good joke about with the name of it, because they dance around calling it virtual reality.
Sure.
Something like, this machine will virtually drag you right there, or something like that. So, typical Terry Pratchett parodying the universe humor. There's several scenes where the computer Hex is working out things for itself, trying to solve problems, and as it's doing so, Pratchett's making a reference to concepts in physics, but he's wording it in Discworld ways.
Yeah.
It probably would not be in our best interest for me to try and look one up on the spot here.
No, fair enough.
So I won't do that. The librarian is essentially making sandwiches for Rincewind to eat while he's on this other world, and they're messing with the virtual reality thing pretty intensely at one point in the book. So Rincewind can kind of tell when there's heat or cold. He can kind of tell when there's pressure. He can somewhat interact with objects. Just very little, because the computer Hex has made a bunch of spells that were just powerful enough to allow him to make minor changes, but that's it, because magic really can't exist in this new universe.
Okay, so he's got like limited interactivity.
Yeah, but they also have the ability to change the size and shape of the person that's there. So they're shrinking him down to witness cellular and bacterial life forms, and he starts screaming at one point because they shrink him down to where he can see all these different microscopic things, and they're just horrific.
Yeah.
They start contemplating whether they should actually try to make life on this planet before they realize that it's kind of doing its own thing and it'll probably get there on its own.
Yeah.
You know, they're at one point they're like, well, look at we had life for a bit, and then a comet hits the Earth, and now there's an ice age, and so they're like, okay, why don't we design a creature that's 2 kilometers long and give it all of this armor, and it just keeps growing, and so if anything hits the planet, it's perfectly protected from all of this. They make this ridiculous creature.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what about, can it die? It's like, oh yeah, it'll die when it reaches the point where it takes it 24 hours and 1 second to consume enough calories per day in a 24-hour day. That's when it dies.
Wait,
So,
meaning that like as soon as it can't eat enough in a day to feed itself, it dies, or
yeah.
okay.
As soon as it gets to the point where it consumes more energy throughout a day than it can possibly consume in that day, that's its life cycle. That's when it ends.
Okay.
And it's just pretty amusing. And then of course they put a bit of extra fun stuff that isn't real science in the science portion.
Okay, like
where
what?
They talk about how in the fiction part there's these crabs that built a civilization and then were wiped out, and then they go to the science portion and they talk about it like it really happened for a second, and then they're like, but actually this isn't what happened as far as we know. The point here is that there could have been all sorts of other evolutionary branches that could have happened and were just wiped out by chance alone, and because of that, we're the ones that ended up being the dominant species.
Right.
Just like little points like that they make silly, they give silly explanations for. The virtual reality thing is probably the most interesting thing that comes out of the book that's anything new. But there's a lot of references to a lot of things that happen in Discworld that are used to explain every single science concept that comes up. They reference death constantly as being a representative of a thing that doesn't actually exist. In terms of things that, like they make the case that, well, heat exists, but cold technically doesn't. Cold is just the absence of heat.
Yeah.
And they get into this weird thing that kind of like an aside where they're like, but really, is it life or death that is actually the thing that exists? Like, they play some word games with how people look at scientific concepts, and I forget exactly what two things they were comparing, but they went through this whole list of like, maybe life is only something that exists in concept because there's non-life, or I don't remember exactly how they worded it.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going off the rails here. I'm trying to remember something that's not. I'm not remembering anything except for the life and death one for some reason. And the heat and cold one is probably the better example. Because, obviously, if you don't have heat, then you have cold, whereas heat is something that requires energy, for one.
Yeah.
So, and they talked about some company that once tried to sell these mirror dishes that were supposed to cool things, and that didn't make any sense. I don't know.
Well, so it's funny that you say that, because since 1998, we've actually learned how to build things that actually do like radiate more power than they take in.
I remember you telling me about this several years ago.
There's some metamaterial science that's been going on that's been creating some really weird things, and like the it's not like it's high power, but it does seem to like fly in the face of common sense thermodynamics.
You worked on some of that, didn't you?
No,
you went to the conferences or something?
I went to conferences where people were talking about it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I remember. So that's what they were called, though, right? Metamaterials?
Well, a metamaterial is just a material that has a substructure that is repeated. So, like, a material is like iron, right? But if you take iron and you make it into a spiral, and then you put those spirals next to each other over and over again, that would be a metamaterial. And so, like, what they're basically doing is they're taking, like, weird and specific... and like taking a bunch of spirals of iron and putting them next to each other doesn't do anything special, right? But it turns out that when you take certain types of materials and you shape them in certain ways, and you basically polymerize them with other specific materials that are shaped in certain ways, that you can get some weird results, basically.
Yeah, so maybe that company had something going for it. I think they were saying it was like a company from like the 1940s or something, and it just raised everyone's eyebrows where they were like, that doesn't work.
Well, back then they didn't have the ability to make the kind of small-scale structures that were needed to have these kinds of weird effects. These effects all happen when you have something that's got structure on the kind of the mesoscopic to microscopic scale, kind of the micron to submillimeter scale. At least that's my recollection of the talks that I've listened to. So, it's all based on kind of growing things in very specific ways, and then kind of putting them together in very specific ways. And it is a little bit counterintuitive, but it's not it's not magic in that sense, you know.
Yeah, it's not really breaking the laws of thermodynamics.
I mean, right? It's just kind of, when you take that whole, like, each of the individual parts obeys the laws of thermodynamics. When you put them together, it creates flows of heat or radiation that seem a little bit weird based on what you would kind of commonly intuit.
Well, is it a matter of efficiency of the material, or is it more like they're still studying this?
I mean, they're still studying it, of course. It's a area of active study, but it's there's a lot of open questions, kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, that's what I meant. Is obviously they're going to keep studying it until they really don't have to anymore, and
even then they're going to keep studying it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that paycheck has to come from somewhere.
As long as the grants keep flowing. They'll hand wave some kind of military application thing, and they'll get hundreds of thousands of dollars.
We're never going to get through a single scientific discussion without bringing up that topic.
As we should.
Rightly so. So, I'm not sure if there's really not much more to say so far with this first book. There's a lot of...
Well, so how far does it go? So where do we end up?
Well, we've got the Roundworld books. Mm-hmm. I've got 3 of them now. I'm reading the first one. Is like, you get to the dinosaurs and just a little bit beyond that.
Okay.
And I think you're kind of ruining my joke here, doggone it. Okay, so my joke was going to be, I was going to end this one by saying, yeah, and just so you know, you were right at the beginning. I didn't finish this book. I've got 70 pages to go.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, they get past the dinosaurs, so I'm not going to look ahead to see if they get to outer space or any... I mean, they bring up outer space constantly, but there's...
I mean, I would assume so. I mean...
I'm assuming that they get to some amount of humanity.
So they created the whole universe, or just like a bit of it, or what?
The universe. They created the whole universe, and then they focus entirely on this round world that they're going to experiment. Because that's one of the jokes at the beginning, is that everyone's messing around with different things in this universe, and mm-hmm. they're like, they're playing games where they're launching comets at each other's planets, and the students are doing practical jokes in it, and then they finally decide to sit down and say, well, what can we do with this?
Right. All right.
They do take it upon themselves to say, okay, let's see if we can find something in this mess where life might be possible. And somehow they find Roundworld, and they start watching it from beginning to end. They watch its development. They watch the development of the solar system that it's in, and this is just blowing their minds, because they're like, this is a universe that makes no sense. There's no turtles flying around, and there's a joke about, what happened? Look, there's life on this planet, and then, bam, a comet hits, and it just wipes out half the life. What kind of sense does that make? Now, here we are on a sensible turtle. When there's a comet, the turtle just sort of swims out of the way.
Right.
And it takes them a while to get used to there's a whole bunch of fun back and forth with the reality of science and Discworld science, such as one of the things that Pratchett pointed out in his early books was that light on the Discworld only travels at roughly the speed of sound. That's one of the great jokes in this book, actually. And it's not even in the story part, it's in the science part.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about how on the Discworld, light only travels at roughly the speed of sound. And they end the paragraph...
So I just reread Thief of Time, and it's 600 miles an hour, which is about the speed of sound, but yeah.
Yeah, they end the paragraph by saying, which would cause all sorts of problems, and I just thought that joke was pretty great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch the wizards in the story be astounded by things like, oh, light's traveling this fast, and they're like, how fast? And then they... Ponder Stibbins, of course, off-screen is doing a crash course on relativity, essentially.
Yeah.
And he comes back with, like, he's trying to explain to the wizards the speed of light in this reality. It acts really weird, and so one of the wizards is like, okay, so let me get this straight. So I'm standing on something that is moving at the speed of light, and then I throw something, but it still can't move faster than I'm already moving.
Right, yeah.
It's really fun to read through these. The wizards are simultaneously the smartest people on the Discworld and the most bumbling.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is another joke in the book that I'll go ahead and spoil is the computer Hex is leagues beyond everyone in terms of intelligence. And it's constantly coming up with the right answers for things. They're telling the wizards exactly what they need to know.
Yeah.
And at one point in the story section, you get to have some of Hex's inner thoughts where essentially it says that, well, you know, I would tell them this, but I'm pretty sure they already know it because the wizards are obviously smarter than me. And the follow-up joke to that is, and much better at disguises as well. The joke, of course, being that they're disguising their intelligence with sheer buffoonery.
Right, right.
And the reason that I tell it in this half-wit way is, read the book, read the line in its purity.
So what's this book called specifically? This particular book?
This particular book is just called The Science of Discworld, and apparently they decided to make 4 more of them afterwards. My assumption...
Well, so The Science of Discworld is a very... What's the word? Like, complete title. So, like, what's the second book called? Just out of curiosity.
Well, that's the thing. When I first saw the titles for the books, my assumption was that after they wrote the first one, they were like, you know, we should probably do another one. Because you're right, it is a complete title. Yeah. And then the second one is The Science of Discworld 2. So they go numerically, but then they have a subtitle. The Science of Discworld 2, The Globe.
Okay.
And actually, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and read off the descriptions of all 5 books for you right now.
Okay.
So you get a good idea of how this plays out.
Yeah.
The Science of Discworld, the first in a series in which Roundworld is created.
Mm-hmm.
The Science of Discworld 2, The Globe. The wizards battle the elves to determine the future of humanity on Roundworld in a madcap journey through the development of the human mind and the development of culture.
Okay.
The Science of Discworld 3, Darwin's Watch. The wizards must set things right when an obscure English vicar named Charles Darwin publishes his best-selling book, Theology of Species, and derails Roundworld's scientific evolution. The Science of Discworld 4, Judgment Day. The wizards are obliged to defend their godlike creation of Roundworld in court against the noble religious Omnians.
All right.
And maybe there were only 4. Did I miscount? There might have only been 4. I might have miscounted the books.
So this whole time you've been telling me that these 5 books. And just now, when you go and look at the actual titles, you're like, oh, there's only 4.
3 shall be the number of the counting, and the number of the counting shall be 3. 5, I guess, was right out.
Apparently.
So, just a little bit of background. That last one that says they have to defend their creation of Roundworld in court against the Omnians. There was a book called Small Gods, and in that book, there's a religious order called the Omnians who believe that the Discworld is actually round, and they wage a religious war on the rest of the world that happens to know that it is not round and is in fact flat on the back of a giant turtle.
Right.
And by the end of that book, it kind of plays out where in the future books, the Omnians have accepted that the world is flat, but spiritually, it has a roundness, and it's one of them things where it's like, okay, the world is flat, but this is our religion now. We're just changing these little things here.
Okay.
And so the idea that after the Omnians had thousands of years of religious war to culminate in, you know what? You guys are right. That someone goes and creates a round world probably makes for very hilarious courtroom antics. So that should be interesting to see. I'm looking forward to that book probably more than all of them. The elf one will be fun too, because the elves are a major villain in the Discworld books. They don't actually share an existence on the Discworld as an actual terrestrial race. They're locked away in an alternate dimension and only really appear in one book, It's called Lords and Ladies. It's one of the books with the witches. And Granny Weatherwax has to prevent the elves from returning to Discworld. Because basically they're dicks. They're complete dicks. And they like to torture things for fun. It's actually one of my favorite Terry Pratchett quotes. He says, I don't remember the whole thing, but it was something like, elves are wonderful. They inspire wonder. Elves are something else, something. And then he gets to terrific. He goes, elves are terrific. They beget terror.
Yeah, nice.
So this I guess is a good intro to the Science of Discworld. I didn't really intro too much of what goes on in it, but it's a science book. You don't want it all spoiled up front. You want to go in and read it.
It's a Discworld book. You also don't want it spoiled all up front. No, I mean, I think this is a reasonable kind of top level look at the first book. But like, I mean, it's a Terry Pratchett book. You should go read it. Everyone who's listening to this, go read Terry Pratchett books. Doesn't matter which one. Maybe this one, maybe some other one, whatever one strikes your fancy.
And if you're one of those weird people that is turned off by the idea of having a book introduce heavy scientific concepts to you, again, you don't need to be for this. It's all presented in a fun way. They're not going to inundate you with formulas for relative. There's no formulas except for the one with Malthus that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's just basically like if you were sitting in a room and someone was talking science at you and doing it in an entertaining way.
Right.
It's kind of meant for, it's definitely a layman book.
Okay, that's good. That means it has a fairly wide audience.
Yeah.
Or potential audience,
anyone could sit down and read this and get some enjoyment out of it.
Nice.
Like okay, so for the very scientifically curious, think back to when you were first.
I don't know anybody like that.
Yeah, there's virtually no one I've ever heard of that. You might be close, but I don't know.
Close what?
Yeah, you may be close to one of the scientifically curious people I know. Just a little bit.
Maybe a little.
I mean, I guess like, okay, so at the very least, I can say that you have a PhD in science. So I feel like your interest is a little bit more than the average layman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Slightly higher.
Just a bit.
An infinitesimal amount. We'll call it epsilon.
Yeah. And
because that's something that laymen would do, is call something small epsilon.
I mean, I wouldn't.
Crap.
So think back to like when you were first getting into science, and so you found the science book on the shelf that was like, oh, I'll check this out. And it didn't really describe mathematics and give you formulas and explain in minute detail how everything worked. It was just like, hey, here's some concepts that someone discovered, and these are cool things about it. This is the here's cool science stuff book. But it's not the stupid here's cool science stuff kind of thing that you get with, say, the I effing love science group that originated on Facebook.
The science tidbit group that I complained about earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, the science tidbit group is it's like the lowest common denominator of actually having something that resembles a passing interest in science.
Well, there's a lot of people that have a passing interest in science. There's a very small group that has a passing interest in rigorousness.
Yeah, but even those who have a very high interest in the rigorousness of science got their start with things that were presented more for the layman, no doubt.
Sure.
Be it scientific television or science fiction shows or educational programming or early science books, young reader science stuff, science fiction novels. I'm going to go ahead and say that I feel like most people that got into things like physics and mathematics and so forth have at least a tendency to enjoy the concepts that come out of science fiction, if not science fiction itself.
Sure.
So this is definitely one of those books that someone might pick up and read and be like, you know what? This kind of makes me more interested in science.
Right. That's good. I mean, it's one of those things to kind of provide a framework, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it does a good job at that. It's one of the more enjoyable layman science books that I've read.
I mean, some is the language kind of at Pratchett's usual level, like kind of that.
It is, yeah. It's
area where it can kind of dip into like the young adult without too much difficulty, kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I could definitely have picked up this book when I was in elementary school, if I wanted.
Okay. Yeah.
And at the very least, a middle schooler could pick this up and learn a heck of a lot more about the concepts that they're going to discuss in middle school and high school than middle school or high school is going to teach them.
Right.
They won't learn the mathematical side of it so much, and there won't be any in-depth chemistry. You know, you're not going to learn chemical formulas or anything. But the concepts that are discussed go well beyond what is usually presented in a high school curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes reading the concepts and having a good grasp of them is a much better starting point than being thrown into the math courses and then later trying to say, okay, how does this relate to reality?
Yeah.
Not to say that you can't do it. I mean, there's ways to work it both ways. I don't want to denigrate the idea of jumping into mathematics, but it certainly helps if... I mean, how many times have you maybe not been in a discussion, but talked with someone about, oh, well, when am I going to use this stuff in real life? And you're thinking to yourself, actually, there's a lot of ways you could use it, and all of them would not necessarily not be beneficial to you. I mean, there's a lot of jobs that require math, and I routinely hear people, especially my niece when I'm tutoring her, say things like, what am I going to need geometry for? And so, I don't know, any of the jobs that make you money?
That would help, yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm not going to say that you necessarily need to know how to run a centrifuge to be a nurse, but it would help to get the measurements of medicines right so you don't kill patients.
That would help, yes.
Yeah, so definitely a plus. And I mean, it's not even a matter of necessarily maths. You have to know a lot of the medical terminology to be able to work in those fields.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize the extent that medical terminology goes to. I mean, there's a lot. Like, to be a medical transcriptionist, the amount of Latin you need to know is almost criminal.
Right.
So, having completely derailed the discussion of the book itself, where do we go from here? Do we want to find a nice closing passage, or...
Yeah, you got something that jumps out at you? We can finish up and... what?
Not even a little, but I could probably find something. Let's spend the next hour just flipping through the book. Yeah, I don't know. There's probably not one particular... There was a chapter on tides to kind of give you an idea of how things went. And the chapter on tides, the wizards were like, well, of course there's tides. That's what the moon does. It creates tides. They're like, yeah, but it's doing it weird on this world. And then the science chapter was talking about how tides worked and why sometimes they would be... Why sometimes the tide can be low on one side while it's high on the other, and the swishing around that the moon causes, and yeah, all that fun stuff. So yeah, you'll learn a thing or two reading through a bit of Discworld science.
Okay, well, it sounds like a fun book.
It is, and I'm giving it full recommendations.
Good stuff. All right, well, I guess we'll call it here then.
Sounds good.
We'll pick up next time and talk about... So you had... Well, okay, so let's do a little, hilarious planning before we close down.
Okay.
You suggested to me the topic of analog horror.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that one's going to work yet. I've watched a few of them, and I definitely have some things to say about it, but...
I guess we could talk about them. That would be a topic to talk about, but most of them don't have a lot of writing per se.
Yeah, there's not a lot of substance to most of them. I've seen two that had any real substance to them, and most of them so almost all of them I think would have made better short stories all in all, but the concept is interesting. And what they usually are good at is coming up with some very
disturbing imagery, I guess. Well, anyway, so we're probably going to be talking about that next time, I guess is what we'll say at this point. And, we're going to be talking about writing in more of a meta sense, because we're going to have to be talking about writing in the sense of, like, screenwriting as opposed to, like, just putting down things on a page.
Yeah.
Because that's where things are really kind of at. When you talk about analog horror, it's usually in the form of audiovisual content, because a book is not analog in the sense of analog horror. I mean, it's analog, but it doesn't have the right, what's the word? It doesn't have the right, like, feel to it, or the right aesthetic.
Yeah, analog horror is an aesthetic. It's basically analog in the sense that, they're referring to television,
analog in the sense of
VHS from
and,
the 80s and 90s.
Pre-digital television, yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyway, we're probably going to be talking about that next. So, hopefully we get some time and can come up with something interesting to say about that, which I'm sure we'll be able to figure something out.
And
so, with that, I'll say, everybody, thanks for listening, and we will see you next week, hopefully, and have a good week.
Enjoy your time on Roundworld.
Enjoy your time on Roundworld. Seven rotations of the Roundworld.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cohen. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.